Hi, everybody. It's Phil.Jones here. Nice to see you. This is a hopefully brief video of the materials and discussions and the flip chart work that we all did at a recent Groupwork Skills morning. I'm doing this really for a couple of purposes. One was a little refresher for those who did attend the course. Some information hopefully useful to those who weren't able to attend, but hope to come along to the second part, and maybe information for other people who weren't involved, who would like to be in the future, who just need to know what sort of stuff's happening in these sorts of training events. So as I said, my name is Phil.Jones, and I want to thank everybody who turned up and worked so hard in that morning. That it seemed like it went by very quickly. So what we set out to do was this, or what I set out to do, was to start with welcoming the participants, and I wanted to do that in a way which sort of modelled what I thought it was important about how we make sure that people feel like members. People feel that this is the place for them, and I'm made out. I know I sort of said it's this sort of stuff is made out of hundreds of sort of micro communications nuances, which let people know that I don't know, they're really welcome, or that this is the place for them, or people are really listening, or whatever. And this helps people's participation as well. And we started to talk about development in terms of thinking about open questions. And there's a section coming up about looking at exercises in relation to the learning cycle. But that was our intention. When I asked people what the best hopes are, I got a lot of questions about challenges of group work programs. We'll cover that too. Group worker relationship. I think this is really important, and the morning went past and I didn't have time to address it. I really hope that we will on our second meeting, if that happens. Appreciation, kind of asking people questions about what they valued about themselves, what they valued about their co-workers, what they valued about the group, what worked well on that day, what did they notice about themselves they were pleased with, etc. So that was the kind of agenda, partially successful, not wholly, and I take full responsibility for that. I think what I said during the morning is that I tended to sort of feel like I knew what was going to happen first, and I knew what was going to happen last, but sometimes I wasn't sure what was going to happen in the middle. And I think that was played out. I think warmly welcoming people, ask people what their best hopes are. If this is going to be a useful meeting today, what would you get out of it? What needs to happen today to make it worth your while coming? Those sorts of questions, I think they are in virtually any group or any training event I run. I ask those sorts of questions because I want to help people think about what they want. I want them to help them think about a successful future. And finally, appreciation, having a chance to help people to value themselves and others and modeling that myself. That's really important for me. So topping and tailing, really, really important. Okay, I'm going to continue. One of the things I started to list very early on in the session was, what are these tiny steps? What are these hundreds of different nuances of human communication that helps? And I started to list them. I took a photograph of a PowerPoint, sorry, not PowerPoint, flip chart, because I thought it was useful to keep a record. So first thing I noticed is something about taking responsibility for your own communication. If I ask somebody to do a task, in a group and they don't understand what the task is, then as far as I'm concerned, that's my responsibility. Now, whether or not that's the truth, I certainly find it a very helpful belief because it makes me work really hard and it helps me take responsibility the way in which I describe things. What follows on from that is accepting what people say. We put people into groups and set them with a task. They say they understand it. Whatever they do then, we should accept, even if it isn't right in terms of what we want them to do. It's all part of the process. What we're doing is that we're welcoming people, we're making them members of our group, and we're giving them encouragement and space to talk and to think. If it's not the way that we design it, well, you know, maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong, but the best thing we can do is to encourage people and accept their presentation. Something about saying thank you, I kind of do that. Bringing people back from a group, thank you, stopping people when they're talking a lot, stopping people when they're angry, thank you, thanks for saying that. When people say something that's deeply critical of me, well, thanks for letting me know. I would use thank you a lot. Names, get that right. Pronunciation, particularly with names that perhaps are unfamiliar to you. Map, what I mean by that is I draw a map of the room, little circles for different people, get their names. Jenny's got a pink scarf on. Ahmed's got glasses or whatever. I make little notes because I think people really like it when you say, "Oh, over to you, Trevor," or let's hear a bit more from Shirley or Tom wanted to come in then. It's really encouraging when you do that. Eye attention, there's something about, yes, people, certainly at starter groups, people will talk back to the facilitator. We want them to talk across the group and be answered. So what I tend to do is give my attention through my eyes with the person who's speaking, and then I encourage my eyes around the room. And I hope that conveys the idea that it's across the room that we want. What's the difference between, do you have any thoughts and what are your thoughts? What's the difference between what are your questions and do you have any questions? Open and closed questions, really important. The answer to, do you have any questions? It's almost always no. What are your questions? Kind of assumes that people have questions, and we're willing to wait, and we're eagerly wanting to find out what they're going to say. And when they say, we're going to reward and accept them and be glad that they have asked the questions. None of these things win the day, but they're just little things to tip the odds in our favor. People in a quiet room, or where there's a gap in silence and you're wondering if anybody's going to speak, this is what people do. Before they speak, they breathe. So as you're looking at the group, you'll notice, try it next time. Think, oh, that person's going to speak. Introversion and extroversion, yeah. Very clear, really useful to look at Jungian styles. Myers-Briggs type inventory stuff is useful here. There's some stuff on the internet about this. Introverts tend to get the resources from being quiet inside. Extroverts get the resources from outside. Clearly has implications for running groups. You need to accept both. Using observations. Kerry, you don't seem to be listening. Is a evaluation. Kerry, I've looked across at you a couple of times, and I've noticed you were looking down at your hands, and now you're looking at your phone. That's an observation. It has less judgment to it. It's some judgment because I've drawn attention to it, but it's less judgment, and it's meant to be delivered in a way which is more easily received. But I know you've talked at me for 20 minutes about how angry you are, and I'd like now to continue with the rest of the group. You've talked for 20 minutes about how angry you are, but I'd like now to continue the rest of the group. Tiny, 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 3-letter word, and includes your anger. I'm including your anger and I'm carrying on. But says you're angry, but I'm still carrying on. These are tiny things. Those are some of the things we identified in terms of how we might communicate in groups. Little things, I know. We talked a bit about Maslow, kind of old type of theoretical base, but kind of useful. And it's what Maslow says is that the need below needs to be met before the next need it can be met. Physiological, so this is food and water and what have you. Safety, am I going to be harmed? Is anything bad going to happen to me here? Belonging, kind of teamwork, getting together, forming a group, getting a group working. That can't happen if people don't feel safe. What I've noticed in the pandemic is that whereas I would be working at a belonging or esteem level normally, I now find myself working with groups of people who have or are fearful of their own lives because of the pandemic, or have lost people, lost loved ones quite often, altogether too often. So useful to kind of think about Maslow in those settings. Morabian, what is it that communicates attitudes? Morabian did his research. So we're talking attitudes: friendliness, kindness, cooperation, welcome. These are all attitudes. Morabian says, Albert Morabian, 7% conveyed by words, 38% by tone, 55% by paralinguistic, which includes body language. So it sort of says that we pick up attitudes from things other than words. So when we're planning group work, we need to think about what the room's going to look like, how we're going to lay it out, what we're going to do when people come in, what we're going to do with our bodies, with ourselves, how are we going to respond when somebody comes in late. We still want them to come in, but how are we going to respond with our body language and with the tone of our voice, even when what we might call in the grip, even when we're feeling anxious or cross. So something to think about there. We begin thinking about designing exercises for groups and questions for groups to help people work. And what we're referring to was Cole's The Learning Cycle, a bit of theory about how people learn, and quite well known, having an experience, reflecting on that experience, what that meant to you, what happened just there, conceptualizing. Oh, so what's the rules here about, I don't know, let's say I come out of Brighton Station and I go around the steps at the back and it's icy and I slip and I fall. And there I am nursing my wounds on the statement, thinking about what happened there. It's cold. The surfaces of the steps got slippery and I fell and slipped and fell and hurt myself. So conceptualize. So what is it? It's about ice. It's about water crystals becoming frozen and forming slippery surface. My shoes, I've got leather shoes on. So if I'm going out after dark, it'd be a really good idea if I wore more shoes which weren't leather, which wouldn't be so slippery. Maybe I should wear something in this weather, some walking shoes or some walking boots, because they've got rubber soles, they don't slip. So what I'm going to do next time, I'm going to put on I'm in experiment now, I'm going to put my shoes on, see what that's like. And then maybe I'll walk down the same steps and see if it's so slippery. I'll experiment and see what the experience is. So this is thinking about how we learn as human beings. So how do we then start to design exercises in groups? And somebody suggested in the group about working with people with anxiety. So I thought, yeah, let's do that. So we all got into groups and started working on that. I'm going to give you my answers or my suggestions, very, very few suggestions about what might constitute an exercise in these situations. I started with reflections for people with anxiety, people coming to a group. Get in turn to the person next to you and tell them about a time when you thought you were becoming anxious, but you did something to avoid it. What did you do? What helped? Tell us about a period in your life when you were less anxious. What was happening instead? And I could imagine scenarios where you could, getting people into groups of 3s or 4s. And maybe you could say, I don't know, you could do it in, between 0 and 10. Tell us about a time when you were less anxious. Between the ages 10 and 20, tell us about that. You can say, you could sort of structure things in ways. The important thing about this is their questions, and they're questions that are there to encourage and to allow people to think. The question and then the space and the encouragement are the things that will help people to get into this in a way that might start to develop resources for themselves. And that's the best kind of learning, really. If there's one thing in your life that tended to help when you were experiencing anxiety, what would you say that was? You get people think, I don't know. And you see people going, oh dear, but get them in pairs, get them to get to know each other. They'll hear somebody else come up with ideas and think, oh, would that work for me, etc., etc. That's reflection. That's that part. This is the bottom. What would it be? 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock on the circle. Sort of conceptual, making rules up. Formulating understanding from reflections. Given everything you've said, what is your understanding about what triggers your anxiety? Helping to develop a concept of my anxiety. What do you think are the 5 best things for you to do to help when you're feeling this way? So we're starting to move towards experiment now by designing kind of to-do list, top tips. And here's a sort of third person exercise. Suppose you were asked by a school teacher to help design a lesson for them. And what to tell them about anxiety in a kind and helpful way. Now, remember, this is not about you're going to go into school and talk about your anxiety. I think that's probably too much for many people. But what if a school teacher friend said, what would you want 10-year-old kids to know about anxiety? Might be another way of developing some conceptual growth in terms of understanding what goes on for me. Next up, experiment exercise. Okay, and this is going to be about kind of designing things for future experience. Make a tick list. You can imagine a box that you tick by your bed for the next time, and keep it there for the next time you feel anxious. You can look at your tick list. What should you do when you wake up on that morning? Make up 3 things to say for yourself before encountering a situation where you often feel anxious, and developing that. Describe the stages in an event where there may be some anxiety. Now, you might have had conversations in the group. Maybe it's about visiting school. Maybe it's about going for a job interview or going down to see your benefits advisor. Describe the stages in the event where there might be some anxiety, and what would you do at each of these stages? Preparing to leave the house, leaving the house, traveling to an appointment, arriving at the office. What would you do at that point? So there's, again, thinking top tips of that kind of area. And experience exercise. Now, this is a little bit, with something like anxiety, it's a bit more difficult. Something like job interviews, a bit easier. We can role play, we can set up a job interview, we can set up a presentation. But something like anxiety is going to be difficult. We certainly don't want to make people experience anxiety in the group. So maybe what we can do is to think about a third person. I've invented somebody here. Samira is a meeting with her mother tomorrow for coffee. Samira also often feels upset after seeing her mum, leading to a couple of days of angry feelings. How would you advise Samira? So we're inventing a third person to come in who can act on our behalf as somebody we can try out exercises with. Okay, so there's a series of exercises around using the learning cycle around anxiety. I hope that's helpful for you. People talked about challenges, sort of challenges that they had in groups, and we had a discussion about what we might do. People talking about their social worker negatively, and we got into a discussion about sort of ground rules, and there was various discussions about, are we allowed to talk about people who aren't present in the meeting, in our group meeting, and how might we describe that for them? There was something about whether or not we would use names as well. They may be doing a session about managing professionals, how to get the best out of your social worker. Might be a very useful thing to do for people who are where social workers are involved, or where they're safeguarding, or they're trying to make a relationship. So it needs a lot of thought, that really, in terms of rules, in terms of maybe asking people, my social worker is a bastard. Okay, what do they see? Goes back to observations. What do they see? What do they hear that's left you feeling so upset about them? Different kind of conversation. People dominating the discussion. I suppose I use a very simple technique of, I do a lot of encouraging people, making sure going around the room that I'm nodding and looking at people and trying to, as much as it didn't look weird, but I'm trying to sort of say, I'd love to hear from you, And I suppose if somebody's talking too much in extreme circumstances, I would not do that to them. I might do it to everyone else, and I might gracefully and kindly, if possible, as possible, not look at them. Sometimes I might say, thanks, Deirdre. It's been great to hear about that. I'm going to draw other people in now. It's a way of describing what I'd like to see. Group members falling out. Gosh, there's different varieties of and colours of this, isn't it? I think it's something about naming it. If it's not something that's become a big problem, or it's sort of under the surface but not being addressed in the group, say, really feel like you two, I don't know, the way you're looking at one another makes me wonder if there's, feeling a bit of tension today. Maybe there's an opportunity to take people aside and breaks, or maybe say, listen, I really want you to stop now, but I'm going to give you a chance to chat to you later, if that's okay. People being really mentally ill. We had a conversation, or people's behaviour about above and below the waterline. and that was a picture of a ship. Whereas if you get holes above the waterline, it's not very nice, makes the ship look ugly. But if you have holes below the waterline, then the ship sinks. So what's the behavior that we're going to see? We're seeing, is it seriously getting in the way of people participating, of the group meeting, doing the work of the group? And if so, it may be below the waterline, in which case we have to, I don't know, wait for a gap, wait for a space to address it, or in the final point, when to stop a group or ask a member to leave. People talked in our session about shame, about avoiding shame, and I couldn't agree more. So if we need to ask somebody to leave, well, why not manufacture a break and then draw them to one side and say, look, I'm afraid, it's not working today. Why not go home? We'll have a chat later. And then when they've gone, we come back and we say to the group, it just wasn't their day today. And we've had a chat and they're going home, but we hope to see them again. We'll let you know. So about managing that. I kind of finished, as I mentioned earlier, I've kind of finished every group with some sort of session of appreciation. What have you been asking questions like, what have you been most pleased to notice about this group? Getting people to talk about that. What have you been most pleased to notice about yourself during this group? What have you done that you feel proud of? There's lots of, again, third person exercises you could use. Like if your best friend was watching you now, what would they be proud of? What would they be pleased about? I tend to use the word pleased. Pride sometimes seems too far away for lots of people. And what are you wondering about doing differently as a result of our conversations today? I suppose I tend to do that rather than say, what are you definitely going to do differently? What are you going to change? I want people to change, of course, but I want to also invite them to do it. What are you wondering now that you might do differently? It's quite a light touch, because I want them to do the work about thinking about what the most successful future would be for them. So that's how we ended the group. I want to say thank you ever so much for your attention today, and attention viewing this video and on the course. I look forward to seeing you all again. Please give me a buzz. The details are there. Website details are there. I'd be happy to answer any questions or help you with any more of the detail. Thanks very much, and have a good rest of your day, wherever you're doing. Thanks.